Picture the end of an exhausting day. Your legs ache with every step, your sandals are filled with grit, and the weight of your armor feels like it could press you straight into the earth. You are a soldier in a Roman legion, and you have just marched 20, maybe 30 miles under a relentless sun. The only thought in your mind is rest. But around you, there is nothing, just an empty field, perhaps a grove of trees, and the ever-present possibility of a hostile enemy lurking in the shadows. In a matter of hours, this empty space must become your home, your fortress, your sanctuary. This was the daily reality for countless soldiers across the ancient world, a logistical miracle repeated every single day from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Persia. How did ancient armies, vast machines of men and material, perform this incredible feat? How did they transform a blank slate of landscape into a secure, organized, and fully functional military base, all before darkness fell? This is the story we are going to uncover together. Forget the dramatic charges and the clashing of swords for a moment, and look instead at the quiet, disciplined genius that made those battles possible. The ancient military camp was not just a place to sleep. It was a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, a testament to human organization on a staggering scale. It was a mobile city, built and dismantled with the sunrise and sunset, complete with streets, headquarters, hospitals, and formidable defenses. The ability to create such a haven anywhere, anytime, was arguably one of the greatest strategic advantages an ancient commander could possess. It was the backbone of campaign, the foundation upon which empires were built and defended. From the legions of Rome, whose camps were so standardized they became the blueprints for cities across Europe, to the sprawling siege camps of Alexander the Great, this practice was the unsung hero of military history. So, consider this video your all-access pass. We are going to journey back in time and walk through the process step by step, from the moment the lead scouts selected the perfect piece of ground to the final watchfire being lit, signaling a night of hard-earned safety. We will explore the incredible logistics, the sheer physical labor, and the unbreakable discipline that turned a patch of dirt into a fortress. We will see how these temporary cities functioned, how they protected thousands of men, and how their very design projected power and control across conquered lands. This is more than just a history lesson. It is a look into the ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit under extreme pressure. Get ready to see history's greatest fighting machines in a whole new light, not just as conquerors on the battlefield, but as builders in the wilderness. But every grand construction project, even a temporary one, begins with a single critical decision. Before the sound of shovels hitting dirt or the shouts of centurions organizing their men, came the quiet, high-stakes work of the scouts. The fate of the entire army could hinge on their judgment. They weren't just looking for a field to sleep in. They were searching for a piece of land that could guarantee survival until morning. The first and most non-negotiable requirement was fresh water. An army is a massive, thirsty organism. Thousands of men, hundreds of horses and mules, all needed a constant, clean supply. A location without a reliable river, stream, or spring was immediately discarded. No matter how perfect it seemed otherwise, without water, an army would wither in a matter of days. The second priority was security. The ideal spot was a gently sloping hilltop, offering a commanding, 360-degree view of the surrounding countryside. This high ground made it incredibly difficult for an enemy to launch a surprise attack, as they would be seen struggling uphill long before they reached the perimeter. But the slope had to be just right. Too steep, and the camp's own movements would be hampered. Too flat, and it would be vulnerable to flooding. The Romans were masters of this, often choosing a south-facing slope. This wasn't just for the pleasant morning sun. It helped the ground dry quickly after rain, preventing the camp from turning into a muddy, disease-ridden swamp. Good drainage was as crucial as a strong wall when it came to keeping an army healthy. The scouts also had to think like city planners. The land needed to be not only defensible but also spacious and clear enough to accommodate the entire force, which could number in the tens of thousands, along with its massive baggage train of siege engines, supplies, and the soldiers' personal kits. A site hemmed in by dense forest or jagged rocks was a death trap, offering cover for enemy infiltrators and making it impossible to form a proper defensive line. Scouts would carefully probe the ground, testing for marshy soil that could collapse under the weight of a palisade wall. They were essentially assessing the land's personality, looking for any hidden threat or inconvenience. A spring might look inviting, but if the land around it was a bog, it could lead to dysentery and fever, silently crippling the army more effectively than any sword. This meticulous selection process, driven by hard-won experience, transformed the simple act of choosing a campsite from a matter of convenience into a precise military science, the first and most vital move in the daily chess game of ancient warfare. With the perfect site secured by the advanced scouts, the real magic could begin, a transformation so swift and precise it must have seemed almost supernatural to any observer. And no one performed this magic with more ruthless efficiency than the Roman legion. For the Romans, setting camp was not an ad hoc affair. It was a standardized drill, a ritual perfected over centuries. Every camp, or castrum, followed the exact same blueprint, a rigid grid plan that was as familiar to a soldier serving in Britannia as it was to one stationed in Egypt. This was the secret weapon, not just discipline, but predictability. Imagine a massive, invisible chessboard being laid over the landscape. The first and most crucial step was establishing the center of this board, the headquarters tent, or the praetorium. From this point, a chief surveying officer, using a simple but brilliant instrument called a groma, would sight the two main axes of the camp. The first, running north to south, would become the Via Praetoria. The second, crossing it perfectly at a right angle, was the Via Principalis, the camp's main street. These two roads didn't just provide pathways, they sliced the camp into 4 precise quadrants, creating an instant and logical organization for the entire temporary city. This grid system was the backbone of Roman military logic. The area closest to the praetorium, just behind the Via Principalis, was reserved for the most important structures, the tents of the senior officers like the legate and the tribunes, and the sacred space housing the legion's standards and treasury. Flanking this central zone, along the Via Principalis itself, were the barracks for the elite first cohort and the cavalry. Then, extending outwards in orderly rows, each legionary century, a unit of around 80 men, was allocated its own perfectly rectangular plot of land. Every soldier knew his place in this grand scheme. A soldier from the 5th century of the 3rd cohort, arriving in the dead of night, could find his tent without a moment's hesitation because its position relative to the main streets was always the same. This eliminated chaos and confusion, allowing thousands of men to settle into a defensive formation with breathtaking speed. It was a mobile, prefabricated city, and every citizen soldier held the blueprint in his mind. The allocation of space within this grid was a direct reflection of the army's hierarchy and needs. The centurion, the backbone of the legion's discipline, had a larger tent at the head of his century's street, a symbol of his authority. The common soldiers slept 8 to a leather tent, sharing the space with their equipment, but the camp was more than just sleeping quarters. Specific areas were designated for specialists, the engineers, the doctors, the blacksmiths with their mobile forges. There was even a marketplace, the forum, where merchants who followed the army could set up shop. Every function of a permanent settlement was accounted for in this temporary space. The genius of the castrum was that it turned the army itself into a single, cohesive organism. The rigid layout meant that commands could be relayed efficiently. Reserves could be rushed to any point along the defenses without getting lost in a maze of alleys, and a sense of universal order prevailed. In a world of constant uncertainty and potential danger, the Roman military camp provided a psychological fortress as much as a physical one, a familiar island of routine in the chaotic sea of campaign. This unwavering standardization, this ability to recreate a piece of Rome anywhere on Earth, was a profound statement of power and a key ingredient in the empire's enduring dominance. While the Roman system was a marvel of standardization, it was far from the only solution to the nightly problem of sheltering an army. Across the ancient world, different cultures developed camping traditions that reflected their own unique military doctrines, environments, and resources. A nomadic steppe people like the Mongols, for instance, would have viewed the Roman legions' heavy digging and construction as laughably slow. For armies built around swift, hard-hitting cavalry, like the Mongols or the earlier Parthians, the highest priority was not permanent-looking walls but breathtaking mobility. Their camps were often simple clusters of round tents, known as yurts or jurs, that could be packed onto carts or spare horses in a matter of minutes. There was no grid of streets, no deep ditch. Defense came not from a static perimeter but from the army's ability to stay on the move, to strike and vanish, using the vastness of the landscape as its primary fortification. Their camps were more like temporary lairs, leaving a minimal footprint and allowing the army to remain an elusive, unpredictable threat. This approach highlights a fundamental military trade-off: the security of heavy fortifications versus the strategic advantage of lightning speed. In the Greek world, the hoplite armies of city-states like Sparta and Athens established camps known as a stratiopton. These were fundamentally different in spirit from the Roman castrum. The Greek camp was less a miniature city and more a practical mustering ground for the citizen soldiers who made up the army. Its location was always strategic, often on high ground near a reliable water source, but its layout was usually much more organic. There was no standard blueprint enforced across all of Greece. Instead, the camp would form around the contingents from different city-states or the rival clans within an army, often leading to a somewhat haphazard arrangement. The focus was on the central mustering area where the phalanx would form up, and the tents of the generals and important figures, while ditches and simple stockades might be built if the army expected a long stay or was near an enemy. The Greek camp relied more on the natural defensibility of the terrain and the formidable reputation of the hoplite phalanx itself. It was a functional base, but it lacked the obsessive, ingrained order that made the Roman camp a tool of psychological control as much as physical safety. Perhaps the most fascinating examples come from commanders who had to blend different traditions out of sheer necessity. Take Hannibal Barca during his incredible campaign in Italy. His army was a mosaic of cultures: Carthaginian officers, North African infantry, Spanish cavalry, and his most famous assets, war elephants. This force did not have a single unified camping manual. Hannibal's genius lay in his ability to adapt. He would have absorbed the best practices from the various mercenary contingents under his command, likely creating a hybrid system. When stationary for a longer period, such as during winter quarters, his camps probably incorporated more substantial defenses, perhaps inspired by Hellenistic influences. On the march, however, speed and security were paramount. He would have prioritized the same essentials as the Romans: water, defensible ground, forage for his animals, but the layout would have been dictated by pragmatism, allowing each group its own space while maintaining a cohesive defensive perimeter that could be quickly assembled and struck. This flexibility was a testament to Hannibal's leadership, proving that the ultimate skill in ancient logistics wasn't just following a perfect plan, but ingeniously improvising with the tools and traditions at hand. Now, with the blueprint etched into the mind of every officer and the surveyor's stakes driven into the earth, the next phase could unfold with military precision. But before the first shovel of earth was turned for the great ditch, a different, more urgent operation had to commence. The main army, a sprawling column that could stretch for miles, was still vulnerable on the march. It could not simply amble onto the chosen site as one chaotic mass. The transition from a moving column to a stationary fortress was a delicate and potentially lethal maneuver. This critical task fell to the army's advance guard, its vanguard. These were not the heavily armored legionaries. They were the agile, fast-moving troops, light infantry known as velites in the Roman army, or specialized cavalry scouts. Their mission was one of immense pressure: to be the first boots on the ground and transform an empty field into a secure staging area before the bulk of the force arrived. Picture these men, galloping or double timing it ahead of the main column. Their eyes scanned the tree lines, the ridges, any place an ambush could be hiding. They are racing against the fading light and against any enemy force that might have spotted the army's dust cloud on the horizon. Their first objective is to sweep the immediate area, clearing out any small enemy patrols or lookouts. A single hostile scout hiding in a thicket could relay the army's exact position and strength back to his commander, turning a night of rest into a night of bloody chaos. This initial sweep is tense and methodical, a game of cat and mouse where the stakes are the survival of thousands. Once they are reasonably sure the immediate vicinity is clear, their work shifts from hunting to securing. They do not have the time or manpower to dig fortifications, so they improvise. They establish a preliminary defensive line, a cordon of sentries using the landscape itself as their ally. A small stream might mark one flank, a line of large boulders another. These natural features become the initial boundaries of the camp to be a temporary wall of vigilance held by the army's most alert soldiers. This period is one of controlled chaos. As the vanguard holds this fragile perimeter, the head of the main army begins to arrive. The noise level skyrockets, the clanking of armor, the shouts of centurions, the braying of mules, and the rumble of carts carrying the army's siege engines and supplies. The advance guard's role now is to manage this influx, guiding each unit to its preordained position within the invisible grid that the surveyors have laid out. They are the traffic directors for an ancient military metropolis under construction. The cavalry, needing quick access to the gates for sorties, is funneled to its designated area along the Via Principalis. The legions are directed to their quadrangles. It is a monumental feat of coordination, ensuring that the army files into the camp in an orderly fashion, rather than crowding into a defenseless mob. The success of this initial establishment phase set the tempo for everything that followed. A bungled arrival could lead to confusion, delays, and a camp that was vulnerable long into the night. But when executed perfectly, it allowed the next, most physically demanding stage of construction to begin without a moment's lost time, as the first units to enter the secured perimeter immediately dropped their marching packs and picked up their tools. And so, with the vanguard securing the perimeter and the army filing into its preordained spaces, the scene erupts into a symphony of coordinated labor. This was the moment that truly separated a professional army from a mere armed mob. Setting camp was not a task delegated to a small engineering corps. It was a total team effort, a meticulously choreographed dance involving every single soldier, from the greenest recruit to the most grizzled veteran. The moment a legionary dropped his marching pack in his century's designated plot, he immediately exchanged his pilum, his javelin, for a dalabra, a combination pickaxe and shovel that was as essential to a Roman soldier as his sword. This was not considered demeaning work. It was a fundamental part of his duty, a skill drilled into him with the same intensity as his swordsmanship. The division of labor was ruthlessly efficient, transforming thousands of tired men into a single, purposeful organism. The army operated like a well-oiled machine, with each component knowing its exact function. The task assignments were not shouted in a chaotic free-for-all. They flowed down the chain of command with precision. The legate and his tribunes would issue the overall orders, which were then broken down by the centurions for their respective centuries. A centurion, the backbone of legion discipline, would bark out specific duties to the 80 men under his command. One maniple, a unit of 2 centuries, might be assigned the critical job of clearing the entire perimeter of brush, rocks, and any other obstructions that could provide cover for an attacking force or hinder the construction of the rampart. This was back-breaking work, swinging axes and sickles to carve a clean, open-killing field around the future walls. Simultaneously, another group, perhaps the next maniple in line, would begin the monumental task of digging the fossa, the main defensive ditch. This was no shallow trench. Roman military manuals specified a ditch that was often 9 feet wide and 7 feet deep. Using their dalabras and wicker baskets to haul away the earth, these soldiers would work in shifts, their movements synchronized to create a continuous, formidable obstacle. The soil they excavated wasn't just discarded. It was piled inward, forming the base of the vallum, the rampart wall. Meanwhile, a third, highly specialized detachment would be dispatched under guard to a nearby wooded area. These were the timber-cutting details, armed with axes and saws. Their mission was to fell hundreds of young trees, sharpening one end of each trunk to create the pointed stakes for the palisade. This was dangerous work, as these small groups were vulnerable to attack far from the main army's protection. Every stake they produced was a vital component of the camp's security. While the outer defenses took shape, other soldiers focused on turning the grid of empty plots into a functional living space. Within each century's area, men worked together to pitch their heavy leather tents, 8 men to a tent, securing the guy ropes and ensuring their temporary home was sturdy against wind and rain. Meanwhile, specialists attended to the army's other critical needs. The cavalrymen saw to their horses, the medics set up the field hospital, the cooks prepared the evening meal in large cauldrons, and the blacksmiths assembled their mobile forges to repair weapons and tools. This was not a haphazard process, but a parallel operation where every task, from the grandest earthwork to the most mundane chore, was executed simultaneously. The cacophony was immense, the rhythmic thud of picks hitting soil, the rasp of saws on wood, the shouts of centurions, the hammering from the forges, but within this noise was a profound order. It was a testament to a level of training and discipline where every man understood that his individual effort, whether digging a ditch or sharpening a stake, was a direct contribution to the collective safety of the entire army. The speed with which this organized chaos coalesced into a fortified city was perhaps the most intimidating display of Roman power, a clear message to any watching enemy that this was not an army to be trifled with. Of all the sights and sounds of a camp under construction, none was more central than the creation of its defensive heart, the mighty ditch and rampart. This was engineering on a grand scale, achieved with nothing more than muscle, iron, and relentless determination. The process began not with a dramatic flourish, but with the simple, grueling act of digging. Soldiers would form a long line along the surveyed perimeter, each man standing a specific distance from the next. On command, they would drive their dalabras into the soil, their movements falling into a steady, rhythmic pattern. The primary goal was to excavate the fossa, the defensive ditch. While the dimensions varied depending on the expected threat and the army's stay, a standard Roman marching camp ditch was an imposing obstacle, often reaching 3 meters across and 2 meters deep. Imagine the sheer volume of earth that needed to be moved. For a camp large enough to hold 2 legions, this meant digging a trench that could stretch for over 3 kilometers. It was a monumental undertaking, but one executed with practiced efficiency. The genius of this system lay in its elegant simplicity. The earth excavated from the ditch was not hauled away, it was thrown inward, directly behind the digging line, to form a raised berm known as the agger or rampart. This created a double benefit: a deep pit for any attacker to navigate and a high wall for the defender to stand upon. But a simple pile of loose dirt would be unstable and easily eroded. To solve this, the Romans employed a clever technique. Before the main digging commenced, a special team would carefully cut away the top layer of turf, the grassy sod, in large, manageable blocks. As the rampart took shape, these sod bricks were used to face the outer slope of the earth wall, creating a reinforced, grass-covered barrier that was far more resistant to collapse and weather. This transformed the agger from a temporary pile of dirt into a sturdy, engineered structure. The speed of this entire operation was nothing short of breathtaking. A well-drilled legion could complete the basic ditch and rampart for a large camp in just a few hours. This was only possible because of the army's organization. Soldiers worked in rotating shifts, with fresh troops taking over for those who were exhausted, ensuring that the work never slowed. The sound of thousands of dalabras striking the earth in near unison must have been a powerful, intimidating drumbeat, signaling to any observer that this was not a disorganized group of travelers, but a highly disciplined military machine. The physical barrier these men created was formidable, but its psychological impact was equally important. For the soldiers inside, The growing rampart was a tangible symbol of their safety, a wall they had built with their own hands that would stand between them and the dangers of the night. For a potential enemy scout watching from a distant hill, the rapid appearance of these defenses sent a clear message. This army was alert, organized, and ready for a fight. A simple ditch and a mound of earth, constructed with such incredible speed and precision, became one of the most potent symbols of Roman military might. But that deep ditch and earthen rampart were only half of the defensive equation. They created the stage, but the main actors in this drama of defense were the walls themselves. For a marching camp on the move, building a permanent stone wall was impossible. The Roman solution was as ingenious as it was practical, a portable, prefabricated fortification that every soldier carried with him. This was the vallum, and its primary component was the sharpened wooden stake, known as a sudes or a vallus. Each legionary was required to carry 2 of these stakes as part of his standard marching kit, alongside his weapons, armor, and digging tools. It was an extra burden, adding weight to an already heavy load, but it was a burden that literally meant the difference between life and death when the sun went down. The process of transforming these individual stakes into a solid defensive wall was a masterpiece of field engineering. Once the rampart was raised, soldiers would plant their stakes firmly into the top of the earthen berm. But they weren't just placed upright in a simple fence. The standard technique was far more robust. The stakes were lashed together in pairs, creating a frame-like structure. These pairs were then tightly secured to a horizontal rail that ran along the inside of the rampart. This method created an interlocked barrier that was incredibly difficult to knock down. An attacker couldn't simply push over a single stake. The entire section of the palisade was braced and supported. From the outside, the wall presented a terrifying forest of sharpened points, angled outward to impale anyone trying to scale the rampart. From the inside, it provided a stable platform for the defending soldiers to stand on, allowing them to throw their pila or shoot arrows over the top with a secure footing. This wasn't a haphazard barrier. It was a professionally constructed wall, built in a matter of hours from components that had been marching with the army all day long. For armies planning a longer stay, such as in a winter camp or a base for a prolonged siege, the defenses evolved from temporary to semi-permanent. The simple palisade of stakes might be replaced by a more substantial timber revetment. This involved building a proper wooden wall, often with a walkway and a parapet, turning the rampart into a true battlements. Watchtowers would be constructed at intervals, especially near the gates, providing elevated platforms for archers and lookouts. In regions that became permanently garrisoned, these wooden forts were frequently rebuilt in stone, becoming the solid legionary fortresses that dotted the frontiers of the empire. The temporary marching camp was the blueprint. It demonstrated a core principle of Roman military thought. Even a single night's stay deserved the security of a fortress. This ethos of constant, ingrained defensiveness is what allowed Roman armies to operate deep in hostile territory for years on end. The Romans' obsession with security didn't stop at the wall and ditch. They understood that to break into a camp, an enemy first had to cross a wide-open killing zone. To make this approach as deadly as possible, Roman engineers developed a series of devious passive defenses. In front of the main ditch, they would often plant fields of hidden obstacles. One common type was called sippi, which were not coins but sharpened branches, often from thorny bushes, that were partially buried in the ground with their sharp points facing outward. From a distance, these would be nearly invisible, creating a nasty surprise for charging infantry or cavalry, tearing at their legs and breaking up the momentum of their assault. These were the ancient equivalent of barbed wire, designed to slow down and disorganize an attacker before they even reached the main ditch. Even more fearsome were the traps known as lilia, or lilies, named for their flower-like appearance when deployed. These were carefully disguised pit traps, each about the depth of a man's chest. At the bottom of each pit, several sharpened stakes were firmly planted. The top of the pit was then covered with a lightweight framework of twigs and turf, making it blend perfectly with the surrounding ground. An enemy soldier running forward in the dark or the chaos of an attack would suddenly plunge into the trap, meeting a gruesome end. Fields of these lilies were laid out in predictable patterns known to the defenders, creating a deadly maze that channeled attackers into predetermined kill zones where archers and artillery could concentrate their fire. This multi-layered approach to defense lilies to break the charge, sippy to slow the advance, a deep ditch to trap them, and a sharp palisade to stop them turned the empty ground in front of a Roman camp into a veritable meat grinder. It was a comprehensive system designed not just to keep the enemy out, but to systematically destroy them if they were foolish enough to try and get in. Of course, the most formidable wall is useless if the doors are left wide open. This brings us to the critical nerve centers of the camp, its gates and watchtowers. While the rampart formed a continuous barrier, the gates were necessarily the weakest points, the places where the wall was deliberately broken. Recognizing this vulnerability, ancient commanders, especially the Romans, turned these potential weak spots into some of the most heavily fortified parts of the entire camp. A standard marching camp typically had 4 main gates, one in the center of each wall, and each had a specific name and function. The Porta Praetoria was the front gate, facing the expected direction of the enemy, while the Porta Decumana was the rear gate, often used for supplies and communication. The 2 side gates were the Porta Principalis Dextra and Sinistra, the right and left gates of the main street. But these were not simple gaps in the wall, they were intricate defensive puzzles. To prevent an enemy from making a direct, headlong charge into the camp, Roman military engineers designed brilliant defensive features. The most common was the clavicula, a curved extension of the rampart and palisade that projected outward from the gate. Imagine not a straight passage into the camp, but an entrance that forced anyone approaching to make a sharp, 90-degree turn, exposing their unshielded right side to the defenders on the wall above. This simple architectural trick eliminated the possibility of a cavalry charge breaching the gate in one swift movement. It slowed attackers to a crawl, funneling them into a narrow, deadly corridor where they could be pelted with javelins, stones, and arrows from 3 sides. In more permanent forts, this concept evolved into massive, freestanding stone gatehouses with multiple doors, murder holes, and guard chambers. But even the simplest marching camp clavicula embodied the same relentless focus on layered defense. Rising above these gates and at regular intervals along the walls were the watchtowers. These were not elaborate stone structures in a temporary camp, but sturdy wooden platforms built on simple log frameworks. Their purpose was to extend the eyes and ears of the army far beyond the confines of the camp itself. A sentry standing on the rampart had his view limited to a few hundred meters. But a soldier elevated 15 or 20 feet on a tower could see over small hills and into dips in the terrain, spotting the glint of enemy armor or the dust cloud of an approaching force long before they became an immediate threat. These towers served as early warning systems, and signals could be passed quickly from tower to tower along the wall, allowing the entire camp to mobilize in minutes. At night, watchfires burned on these platforms, not only providing light for the sentries but also creating pockets of visibility that made it nearly impossible for anyone to sneak up to the ditch undetected. Controlling who passed through these fortified gates, especially after dark, was a matter of life and death. As dusk fell, the gates would be firmly closed, often barred with massive wooden beams that required several men to lift into place. Access was strictly forbidden except in the most extreme emergencies. The guard duty, known as the vigiliae, was taken incredibly seriously. Sentries were posted on the walls at the gates and around the headquarters in meticulously organized shifts, typically lasting 3 hours. The password for the night, the signum or tessera, was issued by the commander himself and passed down through the ranks. This wasn't a casual word, it was a closely guarded secret. Anyone approaching the gate after hours had to correctly give this password to the sentry, who would then challenge them with the classic question, "Who goes there?" Failure to provide the correct response could result in the individual being treated as a hostile enemy on the spot. This system of vigilant guards and secret passwords created an invisible web of security that complemented the physical walls, ensuring that even in the deep silence of the night, the camp remained a hive of alert, disciplined consciousness, its safety guaranteed by the unblinking eyes of its sentinels. While the soldiers were transforming the perimeter into an intimidating barrier of earth and sharpened wood, another equally vital operation was unfolding within the camp's vast, open space. The defensive walls defined the outer shell, but it was the interior layout that gave the Roman camp its soul and its legendary efficiency. This transformation of empty ground into a perfectly ordered grid was not left to chance or guesswork. It was the domain of highly specialized military engineers, the meditors and librators. These men were the architects of the mobile city, armed not with swords but with precision instruments and an unwavering understanding of geometry. Their work began the moment the vanguard secured the area, and it had to be completed with flawless accuracy before the first legionary could pitch his tent. The most important tool in their kit was the groma, a brilliantly simple device that was the ancient equivalent of a modern theodolite. It consisted of a vertical staff topped by a rotating crossarm. From each end of the crossarm, a plumb bob hung on a string. The surveyor would plant the staff firmly in the ground at the designated center point of the camp, the future site of the commander's tent, or praetorium. By sighting along the strings of the plumb bobs, he could establish a perfectly straight line. He would first align one axis, say north-south, and his assistants would march out, driving wooden stakes into the ground at precise intervals to mark the path of what would become the Via Praetoria, the camp's main thoroughfare leading from the front gate. Then the groma would be rotated 90 degrees, and the same process would mark the east-west axis, the Via Principalis. In a matter of minutes, these two crossing roads carved the camp into 4 precise quadrants, creating the fundamental skeleton upon which everything else would be built. The accuracy of this simple tool was astounding, allowing for the creation of right angles and straight lines across uneven terrain with minimal error. With this primary crossroad established, the blueprint for the entire camp was effectively locked in place. The surveyors and their teams would then work outward, using ropes marked at specific lengths to lay out the smaller, parallel streets. The spaces between these lanes were then subdivided into neat, identical rectangular plots, each one allocated to a specific military unit, a century, a cohort, or the cavalry. Every soldier knew exactly where his unit's place was within this grand scheme. A soldier from the 3rd century of the 2nd cohort, arriving exhausted in the dark, didn't need to wander around searching for his comrades. He simply found the Via Principalis, turned down the correct secondary street, and counted off the plots until he reached his designated spot. This eliminated the chaos and confusion that could cripple an army caught unprepared, turning what could have been a disorganized mob into a model of urban planning in a matter of hours. This rigid grid system was far more than just a convenient way to organize sleeping arrangements. It was a powerful tool of command and control. The predictable layout meant that every officer, from the legate down to the centurion, knew the exact location of every unit under their command. In an emergency, such as a night attack, orders could be issued with the certainty that reserves could be rushed to any breach in the defenses along straight, unobstructed streets without getting lost in a maze of alleys. The central location of the praetorium and the forum meant that commands could be disseminated quickly to all 4 corners of the camp. This layout also reinforced the army's strict hierarchy. The prime real estate along the Via Principalis was reserved for the senior officers, the tribunes, and the elite 1st cohort, their larger tents a constant visual reminder of the chain of command. The common soldiers' tents were arranged in orderly rows further out, a physical manifestation of the legion's structure. This meticulous interior planning was the ultimate expression of Roman military philosophy, where order was not just an ideal but a practical necessity for survival, transforming a temporary collection of tired men into an impregnable fortress of discipline. Yet this entire sprawling, organized city of tents and trenches ultimately answered to a single, central command, rising from the very intersection of the Via Praetoria and the Via Principalis, At the exact center of the camp's invisible grid was the praetorium. This was far more than just the general's luxurious sleeping quarters. It was the beating heart and the command center of the entire military operation. Imagine a large, compound-like enclosure, often surrounded by its own low fence or a cordon of guards, creating a distinct space of authority within the larger camp. At its core stood the tent of the legatus, the commanding general. While larger and more comfortable than the standard-issue leather tents of the common soldiers, its primary purpose was function, not opulence. Inside, this space was a hive of strategic activity. Tables would be spread with painstakingly drawn maps on leather or papyrus, detailing the local terrain, known enemy positions, and potential routes for the next day's march. Here, the general would consult with his senior tribunes, the primus pilus, and scouts who had just returned from reconnaissance missions, their boots still dusty from the field. The praetorium complex was the administrative brain of the army. Adjacent to the general's tent were the quarters for his staff officers and scribes, the clerks who managed the mountains of paperwork that kept a Roman legion running. They were responsible for everything from payroll and supply inventories to casualty lists and dispatches bound for Rome itself. Most importantly, this compound housed the legion's most sacred objects, the aquili, the silver or gold eagles that were the soul of the legion, along with the other standards of each cohort and century. The loss of an eagle was a catastrophic disgrace, so they were guarded with an almost religious fervor, day and night. This centralization of command, intelligence, and symbolic identity meant that every order, every piece of crucial information, flowed to and from this single point, ensuring the army moved and fought as one cohesive unit. Directly in front of the praetorium lay the forum, the camp's main square. If the praetorium was the brain, the forum was the camp's vibrant public square, a space that served multiple critical functions. Each morning, this area would buzz with activity as the general might assemble the troops here to issue the day's orders, announce promotions, or deliver speeches to bolster morale before a battle. It was the focal point for the army's collective spirit, but its role extended far beyond military ceremony. The forum was also the designated marketplace. Following the army was a large, unofficial tail of merchants, traders, and camp followers. They were permitted to set up their stalls in this area, creating a bustling bazaar where soldiers could spend their pay on better food, wine, repairs for their gear, or even writing materials to send letters home. This market was vital for morale, providing a small taste of normalcy in civilian life amidst the hardships of campaign. The forum was also the spiritual center of the camp. In one corner, a temporary altar would be erected. Here, the general, acting as the chief priest for the army, would perform sacrifices to the gods, seeking their favor for the upcoming operations. The smell of incense and burning animal flesh would have been a common scent in the forum, a reminder that success was believed to depend as much on divine will as on military skill. The security surrounding this entire central district was exceptionally tight. The elite bodyguards of the general, often specially selected cavalrymen or veterans, were permanently stationed around the perimeter of the praetorium and forum. Their presence was a constant, visible reminder of the hierarchy and discipline that held the army together. Access was strictly controlled, especially after dark. The praetorium and forum, sitting at the literal and figurative crossroads of the camp, were a powerful symbol of Roman order. They demonstrated that even in the most remote wilderness, the army carried with it the essential elements of a Roman town: centralized authority, commerce, religion, and law, all orchestrated from the very center of its temporary, fortified world. Yet for all the grand scale of the ramparts and the strategic precision of the central command, the true strength of the Roman army was forged not in the commander's tent, but in the smallest, most fundamental unit of camp life. Step away from the broad streets and into the grid of identical plots, and you'll find the heart of the legion, the contubernium. This was a squad of 8 men who were more than just comrades. They were a family on the march. These 8 soldiers did everything together. They marched together, fought together, and most importantly, they shared a single tent, creating a tiny, self-sufficient household within the vastness of the camp. This was the bedrock of Roman military life, the microcosm where discipline and camaraderie were cemented. Theirs was a simple but brilliantly practical home, a leather tent known as a papilio, the Latin word for butterfly. When packed away, the tent's components were divided among the 8 men and loaded onto a single mule that was assigned to the contubernium, a walking supply cabinet that also carried the squad's millstone, cooking pot, and rations. When unfolded and assembled, the papilio lived up to its name. Its design was ingenious. A central horizontal ridgepole was supported by 2 vertical poles at either end, and over this frame, large sections of durable, weatherproofed leather were draped, creating a peaked roof and sloping sides that resembled butterfly wings. The men would secure the leather panels with ropes and wooden pegs driven into the ground, transforming a bundle of supplies into a sturdy, weatherproof shelter in a matter of minutes. It was cramped, certainly, but it was their own private space, a sanctuary from the elements and the relentless demands of military service. Inside, the living conditions were Spartan but meticulously organized. There was no room for luxury or even standing upright. The 8 men would sleep side by side on bedrolls laid on the ground, their feet towards the center and their heads near the walls, with a narrow aisle down the middle for access. Their personal kit, their helmets, shields, swords, and pila, would be stored neatly around the perimeter, always within easy reach in case of a night alarm. One corner might be designated for the group's food supplies: sacks of wheat grain, a side of bacon, and a clay jar for their ration of sour wine. The atmosphere inside was thick with the smell of leather, sweat, and the smoky residue from their cooking fire just outside the tent's entrance. This was a space for rest, for quiet conversation, and for the essential maintenance of their gear. The rhythmic sound of whetstones sharpening swords a common evening hum. The contubernium was also a miniature kitchen. Each squad was responsible for preparing its own meals. After a long day's march and construction, 2 men might be tasked with grinding the hard wheat grain into flour using the small hand mill they carried, while others gathered firewood and kindled a small, controlled fire. They would mix the flour with water to make a simple dough, baking it into hardtack or cooking it on a hot stone. A common meal might be a thick porridge, pulse, or a stew enriched with their daily ration of meat. This shared responsibility for cooking and eating was a powerful bonding ritual. Sitting together after an exhausting day, sharing food they had prepared themselves, fostered a profound sense of mutual dependence. The veterans would share stories, the recruits would learn the unwritten rules of survival, and grievances would be aired and settled within the privacy of the tent. The bonds formed in this cramped, leather-scented space were as strong as any blood tie. A soldier fought not for some abstract idea of Rome, but for the 7 men sleeping next to him, the men who shared his food and whose lives depended on his vigilance and skill. This intimate, daily experience of shared hardship and simple comforts was the invisible mortar that held the entire legionary structure together, making the Roman camp not just a collection of soldiers, but a community of brothers. Moving beyond the orderly rows of legionary tents and the bustling central forum, the Roman camp revealed itself as a highly specialized organism, with entire districts dedicated to particular military functions. The needs of the cavalry, for instance, were vastly different from those of the infantry. The equites, the cavalrymen, were the army's eyes and swift strike force, and their section of the camp reflected their elite status and practical requirements. You would find their area strategically positioned along the main street, the Via Principalis, ensuring they had the quickest possible access to the gates for a rapid deployment. This prime location wasn't just about prestige, it was about speed. In the event of a night attack or the need for a dawn reconnaissance mission, the cavalry needed to be saddled and out of the gate before the enemy even knew what was happening. Their space was necessarily more open and sprawling than the tight grid of the infantry lines. Instead of tents, the primary features were long picket lines, where the horses were tethered side by side. The air here was thick with the distinct smells of leather, horse, and hay. The care of these animals was a round-the-clock operation, Each cavalryman was responsible for his own mount, grooming it, checking its hooves, and ensuring it was fed and watered. A dedicated supply of fodder, oats, barley, and hay was a critical part of the army's baggage train, and securing enough grazing land nearby was a constant concern for scouts. The sound of this area was a constant low rumble of whinnies, snorts, and the crunch of animals feeding, a stark contrast to the clanking of armor elsewhere. The health of the cavalry was directly tied to the health of their horses, making this zone a hub of focused, essential activity. Perched strategically along the newly built ramparts, another specialized group prepared their own unique tools of war. These were the positions for the army's artillery, the ballistae and catapults that served as the long-range, heavy weapons of the ancient world. These were not the massive siege engines used for battering city walls, but smaller, more mobile versions designed for field battles and camp defense. A ballista was essentially a giant crossbow on a stand, capable of hurling a heavy spear-sized bolt with terrifying accuracy over hundreds of meters. Scorpions were smaller, rapid-fire versions, while catapults, or onagers, used a single arm and a sling to lob large stones in a high arc. Their placement was a matter of careful calculation. They were often situated on elevated platforms at the corners of the camp or flanking the main gates, giving them overlapping fields of fire across the open ground in front of the defenses. From these vantage points, a single ballista bolt could punch through several enemy soldiers in a line, while a well-aimed stone from an onager could break apart a shield wall before it even reached the ditch. The crews for these weapons were highly trained specialists, often excused from the general digging duties to maintain and calibrate their complex machines. The presence of these artillery pieces transformed the camp's perimeter from a passive barrier into an active killing zone, projecting Roman power far beyond the reach of a legionary's javelin. Perhaps the most telling sign of the Roman army's sophisticated logistics, however, was not a weapon of death, but a place dedicated to preserving life, the valetudinarium, or field hospital. In an age where infection could be a far deadlier enemy than any sword, the Romans understood that a soldier who recovered was a valuable asset saved. The hospital was typically located in a quieter, more sheltered part of the camp, away from the main thoroughfares to provide a calmer environment for the wounded and sick. It wasn't just a single tent, it was a complex of larger tents or, in more permanent forts, a dedicated building with separate wards. Inside, a staff of trained medics, the medici, and surgeons worked with a surprising array of tools that would be familiar in principle to a modern paramedic. Archaeological finds have uncovered Roman medical kits containing bronze scalpels, bone forceps, probes, and even arrow extractors. Hygiene was a priority, instruments were cleaned, and wounds were washed with vinegar or wine, which have antiseptic properties. The medics were skilled at setting broken bones, amputating mangled limbs to prevent gangrene, and stitching wounds. They used opium for pain relief and a wide variety of herbs for poultices and treatments. The existence of a dedicated medical corps, with its own supplies and designated space, speaks volumes about the Roman military mindset. It was a coldly practical investment. The time and resources spent healing a veteran soldier were far less than those required to train a new one from scratch. This institutional care for the individual fighter, this commitment to retrieving every possible ounce of value from its human capital, was a cornerstone of the legion's relentless, enduring strength. But while the walls and the barracks provided safety and shelter, they would mean nothing if the army inside them was starving. This brings us to what was perhaps the most relentless challenge of ancient campaigning, a problem that could undo the most brilliant general and the most disciplined legion: the simple, monumental task of feeding the multitude. An army, as the old saying goes, marches on its stomach, and the stomach of a Roman legion was a bottomless pit. We are talking about thousands of men, each requiring an estimated 3,000 calories or more per day just to function, not to mention the thousands of horses, mules, and other animals that were essential for transport and cavalry. Keeping this vast, hungry organism fueled was a logistical operation as complex and critical as any battle plan. The primary solution to this problem was the army's mobile supply chain, known as the impedimenta, which translates fittingly to the hindrances. This was the massive baggage train that followed the main column, a slow-moving river of carts, wagons, and pack animals that carried the lifeblood of the campaign. The impedimenta was a spectacle in itself, a traveling warehouse containing everything from spare weapons and armor to the siege engines we mentioned earlier, but its most precious cargo was always food. The staples were simple, calorie-dense, and non-perishable. The most important was grain, usually wheat, stored in large sacks. This was the fermentum, the core of the soldier's diet. Alongside it were vast quantities of laridum, salted pork or bacon, which provided essential fats and protein, as well as reserves of sour wine, vinegar, lentils, and cheese. This supply train was the Army's strategic reserve, its buffer against unexpected delays or barren territory. Within the camp, the responsibility for turning these raw supplies into a meal fell squarely on the individual soldier. The Roman state provided the ingredients, but the preparation was a personal or small group affair. Each contubernium, that squad of 8 men, was a miniature culinary unit. They were issued their daily ration of whole wheat grain, and it was then their job to transform it into something edible. This often involved a rotating duty roster within the group. 2 soldiers might be tasked with using the squad's portable hand mill, a simple but effective device made of 2 volcanic stones, to grind the hard kernels into coarse flour. It was back-breaking, monotonous work, the grating sound of stone on stone a familiar noise in every legionary camp each evening. The resulting flour was then mixed with water and a little salt to form a dough, which was baked either into hardtack on a hot stone or, if they had more time, into a simple loaf of bread. Their ration of salted meat would be added to a communal stew pot with whatever vegetables they could scrounge up. This system of self-sufficient cooking had a dual purpose. It saved the army from having to operate a massive central kitchen, and it reinforced the vital bonds of the small unit, as men shared the labor and the rewards of their meal. Of course, the supplies in the baggage train were finite. For any campaign lasting more than a few weeks, the army had to become a foraging machine, actively harvesting the resources of the land it moved through. This is where the practice of fermentatio, or foraging, came in. Each day, even before the camp was fully dismantled, large, organized parties would be sent out from the camp under the command of a tribune or a senior centurion. These were not casual gatherings of men picking berries. They were military operations in their own right, often consisting of hundreds or even thousands of soldiers, because a dispersed foraging party was incredibly vulnerable to enemy ambush. Their mission was systematic and thorough. They would scour the countryside for grain stored in local villages, requisition livestock from farms, and harvest ripe crops from the fields. While this could be devastating for the local population, for the Roman army, it was a matter of survival. The success of these foraging expeditions directly determined how far and how long the army could operate away from its established supply lines. A region rich in resources could sustain a campaign for months, while a sparse or already stripped landscape could force a retreat faster than any enemy army. But not all sustenance came from official rations or organized plunder. The Roman camp also hosted a vibrant, regulated private economy that played a crucial role in maintaining morale. This was the mercatus, the official market. The army was followed by a vast, unofficial tail of civilians, merchants, traders, craftsmen, and families of the soldiers. These camp followers were not a disorganized mob. They were licensed by the army and permitted to set up their stalls in the camp's forum. Here, a soldier could spend his hard-earned pay, the stipendium, to vastly improve his standard of living. Instead of his monotonous grain porridge, he could buy fresh bread, better cuts of meat, olives, fruit, and finer wine. He could have his sandals repaired by a cobbler, his armor fixed by a skilled blacksmith, or even send a letter home with a traveling scribe. This market was far from a simple convenience. For the high command, it was a vital pressure valve. Allowing soldiers to enjoy small luxuries and a taste of civilian life kept morale from collapsing under the strain of campaign life. It also helped circulate currency, and ensured that specialist services were available without the army having to provide them directly. The Mercatus was a controlled yet bustling hub of commerce that turned the sterile military grid into a living, breathing community. It underscored a fundamental truth of ancient warfare. An army was not just a fighting force, but a traveling city with all the economic and social needs that entailed. The constant, fragile flow of supplies, from the slow-moving wagons of the impedimenta, to the returning foraging parties laden with loot, to the bustling market stalls, was the invisible lifeline that made the conquest of the known world a tangible possibility. Yet for all the discipline in building walls and organizing streets, none of it mattered if the camp itself became a breeding ground for disease. A dirty camp was a dead camp, and ancient commanders, especially the Romans, understood this brutal reality with a clarity that seems almost modern. While an enemy's sword could kill a soldier, dysentery, typhus, and cholera could slaughter an entire army without a single battle being fought. The unseen, unglamorous work of managing water, sanitation, and hygiene was therefore not a secondary concern. It was a matter of strategic survival, a silent war waged daily against invisible enemies. The first and most critical priority was a clean water supply. An army of thousands, plus its animals, consumed a staggering amount of water every single day for drinking, cooking, cleaning equipment, and for the animals themselves. A stagnant pond or a muddy stream simply would not do. They were reservoirs for waterborne parasites and bacteria. The advance scout's initial assessment of a site always prioritized finding a fast-flowing river or a clear spring. But securing the source was only the beginning. To prevent contamination, the Army's engineers would immediately set to work. They might construct a small dam upstream to create a settling basin, allowing silt and debris to sink before the cleaner water was channeled towards the camp. In some cases, they would dig shallow wells or line a spring with stones to create a protected collection point. Access to this clean water was then strictly controlled. Specific areas along the bank were designated for different uses, one for drawing drinking water, another further downstream for watering animals, and another for washing clothes or equipment. This simple zoning prevented the cross-contamination that could lead to widespread illness. Perhaps the most impressive feat of ancient military sanitation was the design and management of the latrines. The Romans, in particular, treated human waste not as a nuisance to be ignored, but as a logistical problem to be solved with engineering efficiency. In a semi-permanent or siege camp, they constructed sophisticated latrine buildings that would astonish many people today. These were not just holes in the ground. They were often long, wooden benches with a series of keyhole-shaped openings cut into them. Beneath this bench ran a deep, continuously flowing channel of water, diverted from a nearby stream or spring. Soldiers would sit side by side, and the running water beneath would immediately carry the waste away from the camp, often into a dedicated drainage ditch that emptied far downstream. These latrines were strategically placed in a corner of the camp, as far away from the food preparation areas and water sources as possible, always located downstream. A sponge on a stick, soaked in vinegar or salt water, served as the ancient equivalent of toilet paper, stored in a bucket of water near the entrance. But even in a single night marching camp, sanitation was not neglected. While they couldn't build stone channels, the principle remained the same. A long, deep trench would be dug in a designated area downwind and downstream from the main living quarters. This trench served as the communal latrine. It was a basic but effective solution that concentrated waste in one controlled location, preventing the contamination of the entire campground. Strict regulations governed its use, and after the army moved on, the trench would be filled in to prevent the spread of disease and to leave as little trace of their presence as possible. This meticulous attention to waste disposal was a clear indication that the ancients had empirically discovered the link between filth and disease, even if they didn't understand the germ theory behind it. This emphasis on cleanliness extended to the soldiers themselves. While the popular image of a legionary might be one covered in grime, the reality was quite the opposite. Personal hygiene was drilled into them as a matter of discipline. At the end of each day's march, if a water source was available, soldiers were expected to wash. They cleaned their bodies and, just as importantly, maintained their equipment. A rusty sword or a mildew-weakened shield strap could be as fatal as any illness. In more established camps, this practice evolved into the construction of bathhouses. These were not luxuries, they were essential facilities for maintaining army health. A simple field bath might involve a heated room, a warm room, and a cold plunge pool, all built with wood and leather. The act of bathing, of scrubbing away the sweat and dirt of the march, helped prevent skin infections and parasites, and the hot steam could soothe aching muscles, aiding recovery. The Roman military bath was a place of hygiene first and relaxation second, a crucial tool for keeping the human machine of war in fighting condition. This comprehensive approach to water, waste, and wellness demonstrates that the greatest strength of an ancient army often lay not in its courage on the battlefield, but in its ruthless, systematic dedication to survival in the camp. Yet within this meticulously organized world of leather and sharpened wood, there existed a dimension beyond the practical, a realm of faith and symbolism that was every bit as vital to the army's strength as its walls. The Roman legion was not just a fighting machine, it was a spiritual community, and its camp was a sacred space. At the very heart of this spiritual life were the legion's standards, the signa. These were far more than simple flags or military insignia. They were believed to be the physical embodiment of the legion's soul, its sacred guardians, and the focal point of every soldier's loyalty. The most important of all was the aquila, the eagle. Crafted from silver or gold, with wings outstretched, the eagle was the symbol of Jupiter, king of the gods, and its loss was the ultimate disgrace, a catastrophe that could lead to the entire legion being disbanded in shame. This sacred trust was housed in a special shrine within the Principia, the camp's headquarters, known as the Caecilium. This was the spiritual nucleus of the entire fortress. Imagine a space set apart, often dimly lit by the flicker of oil lamps, where the air was thick with the smell of incense and old wood. Here, the eagle and the other standards of the cohorts and centuries were kept when not on campaign. They were not stored away like equipment, they were displayed with reverence, guarded day and night by specially chosen soldiers. The Caecilium was more than an armory for symbols, it was an active place of worship. Each morning, the commander, acting as the army's chief priest, might lead a ceremony here, offering prayers and libations to the gods on behalf of the legion. Before a battle, soldiers would file past the standards, touching them for luck or murmuring a private prayer, seeking the favor of the divine spirit they believed resided within the metal and wood. The most critical religious act, however, often took place not inside the Caecilium, but in the open air of the Forum, before any major military action, a battle, a movement of the entire army, or the founding of a new permanent fort. The commander would seek to divine the will of the gods. This practice was known as taking the auspices. A special priest, an augur, would accompany the general. The ceremony was a tense, solemn affair watched by the entire senior staff. The augur would mark out a sacred space in the sky with his curved staff, the lidus, and then patiently observe the flight patterns of birds. Were they flying from left to right, a favorable sign, or right to left, an omen of disaster? Did an eagle soar overhead, or did a flock of crows scatter in panic? Alternatively, the signs might be sought through haruspicy, the examination of the entrails of a sacrificed animal, usually a sheep. The haruspex, a different type of specialist, would slit the animal open and meticulously inspect its liver, lungs, and heart. The shape, color, and any marks or imperfections were interpreted as messages from the gods. To the modern mind, this might seem like superstition, but for the Romans it was a sophisticated system of risk assessment. A negative omen provided a perfectly valid, divinely sanctioned reason to delay a battle, allowing a commander to avoid a rash engagement without losing face. A positive omen, on the other hand, was a powerful tool for morale. The general could announce to his troops that the gods had promised them victory. This belief that they were fighting with divine favor was a potent psychological weapon, turning anxiety into confident aggression. The rituals provided a sense of order and predictability in the chaotic and terrifying world of warfare. They offered the comforting illusion that the capricious forces of fate could be understood and appeased, giving men about to stare death in the face a crucial sense of control. The daily religious routines, from the simple offering of incense at the standards to the grand pre-battle sacrifices, wove a thread of the sacred through the entire fabric of military life, binding the legion together not just by discipline, but by a shared faith that they were under the protection of heaven itself. As dusk settled over the camp and the last cooking fires died down to embers, the character of the fortress underwent a profound transformation. The bustling, noisy city of the day gave way to a place of deep shadows and enforced silence, where every rustle and footfall became magnified. This was the most vulnerable time for an ancient army, when the cover of darkness could hide the approach of a stealthy enemy or the mischief of a disgruntled soldier. To counter this threat, the Romans implemented one of their most unforgiving and meticulously organized systems, the night watch, known as the vigiliae. The entire camp did not simply fall asleep. Instead, it transitioned into a state of controlled, vigilant consciousness, its safety entrusted to a rotating roster of sentries who stood as the army's eyes and ears through the long, dangerous hours. The organization of the watch was a masterclass in military logistics, designed to ensure that alertness never wavered. The night was divided into 4 equal watches, each lasting approximately 3 hours, marked by the movement of the stars or the use of simple water clocks. A specified portion of each century, a maniple or even an entire cohort, depending on the perceived threat level, was assigned to guard duty for one of these watches. The system was carefully planned so that no single soldier had to stand watch every night, preventing exhaustion from dulling their senses, yet the duty was frequent enough to be a core part of their service. The change of the guard was a formal ceremony in itself. The relieving watch would be roused from their sleep by the quiet but firm orders of their tesserarius, the junior officer in charge of the watchword. They would arm themselves and assemble at their designated posts just before their watch was to begin. The outgoing sentries would then be formally relieved, reporting any unusual sounds or sightings before finally being allowed to stumble back to their tents for a few precious hours of sleep. This precise handover ensured there was never a moment when a section of the wall was left unguarded. The deployment of these sentries was strategic and comprehensive. They were not merely clustered at the gates. Soldiers were posted at regular intervals along the entire length of the rampart, creating an unbroken chain of vigilance around the perimeter. Additional guards were stationed directly outside the praetorium, protecting the commander and the sacred legionary standards. Sentries also watched over the horse lines, the granaries, and the water supply, any one of which could be a target for sabotage. Each sentry had a specific zone of responsibility, and the punishment for leaving one's post, for any reason, was as severe as for falling asleep. To maintain communication and prove they were awake, sentries were required to call out to one another at irregular intervals, passing a pre-arranged phrase along the wall. This created a soft, echoing web of whispered signals that reassured the officers that the watch was alert and in place. The most critical tool for security after dark was the password, the tessera. This was not a casual word chosen at random. It was issued with the utmost secrecy by the commanding general himself at evening roll call. The word was then passed down through the ranks, from the tribunes to the centurions, and finally to the tesserarius of each century. The name tessera came from the small wooden tablet on which the password was inscribed for the illiterate soldiers to memorize and then pass on. This password changed every single day without fail. Its importance cannot be overstated. In the inky blackness of a moonless night, where identifying a figure by sight was impossible, the tessera was the only way to distinguish friend from foe. Any person or group approaching the camp after the gates were sealed, whether a returning scout or a messenger from an allied force, was required to halt at a distance and shout the password. A sentry would then challenge them with the classic cry, "Qui vivis?" Who goes there? The correct response was the password, followed by the individual's name and unit. Failure to provide the correct tessera resulted in the sentry raising the alarm, and the approaching party being treated as a hostile threat. The consequences for failing in this sacred duty were brutal and absolute. The penalty for a sentry caught sleeping on watch was death, usually by clubbing or stoning at the hands of his own comrades. This was not considered an act of cruelty, but one of grim necessity. The lives of thousands of sleeping men depended on the alertness of a few hundred. A single moment of drowsiness could allow an enemy patrol to scale the wall undetected, open a gate from the inside, or set fire to the supplies. The story of a single sentry's failure leading to the destruction of an entire army was a cautionary tale drilled into every recruit. This ultimate penalty hung over every soldier as he took his place on the cold, dark rampart, a powerful deterrent that fought back against the natural human urge for sleep after an exhausting day of marching and digging. It was a stark reminder that in the economy of survival, one man's mistake could cost the lives of all. Thus, the Roman camp at night was a place of profound contrasts. For the vast majority of the army, it was a sanctuary for deep, recuperative sleep, the sounds of their breathing a low hum beneath the silence. But for the watch, it was a world of intense sensory focus. They stood alone with their thoughts, listening to the sounds of the wilderness beyond the ditch, the howl of a wolf, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. Their eyes strained to separate shifting shadows from genuine movement. Every snap of a twig was a potential threat. The atmosphere was one of constant, low-grade tension, punctuated by the whispered challenges and the distant responses of their fellow guards. This unyielding discipline after dark was the final, essential layer of the camp's defense. It transformed the temporary fortress from a mere collection of walls into a living, breathing entity that never truly slept, its heart beating to the rhythm of the vigilant night watch, ensuring that when the sun finally rose, the army would awaken intact, ready to face another day. But as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, the entire intricate system that had provided a night of safety had to be just as swiftly and methodically undone. The Roman army could not simply linger in its fortress. It had a day's march to complete, and a slow departure was an invitation for disaster. Just as the establishment of the camp was a masterpiece of logistics, its dismantling was an art form in itself, a carefully choreographed retreat from a temporary home, executed with the same relentless discipline that had built it. The signal to begin this complex operation was not a shouted order but a clear, piercing sound that cut through the morning quiet, the trumpet call known as the classicum. This was the first of several calls that would orchestrate the morning's activities. The initial call was a general alert, rousing the men from their sleep and signaling that the time had come to prepare for the day's march. In the dim light, soldiers would emerge from their tents, stretching stiff muscles and immediately setting to work on their first task, packing their personal gear. The 8 men of a contubernium worked together as a single unit, efficiently striking their leather tent. The ridgepole was taken down, the leather panels were carefully folded to avoid creases that could lead to cracks, and all the components were tightly bundled and secured onto the back of their assigned mule. Their personal weapons and armor were checked and donned, their bedrolls packed, and their share of the squad's millstone and cooking pot was stowed. This was a routine so ingrained it required little conscious thought. Following the initial call, a second, specific trumpet blast would signal the next phase, the loading of the baggage train, the impedimenta. This was when the camp truly began to dissolve back into a marching column. The mules and carts that had been parked in orderly rows now became the center of a controlled frenzy. Soldiers assigned to baggage duty worked quickly, heaving sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, and the disassembled components of siege engines onto the waiting wagons. The cavalrymen saddled their horses and led them into their designated place in the forming column. Every item had a specific location, and the process was supervised by junior officers to prevent chaos. The goal was to transform the sprawling, stationary city back into a compact, mobile force capable of moving out at a moment's notice. Concurrently, a less glorious but equally vital task was underway: the sanitization of the site. Just as they had built latrines with precision, the Romans departed with a conscientiousness that modern archaeologists are deeply thankful for. The long trench latrines, which had served the army for the night, were now systematically filled in with the same earth that had been excavated from them. This was a critical health measure, preventing the spread of disease to the local population or to any Roman force that might later pass through the area. But it was also a tactical decision. An abandoned camp with its defenses intact could provide a ready-made fortress for a pursuing enemy. To prevent this, a detachment of soldiers would often be tasked with slighting the defenses, deliberately breaking down sections of the rampart, filling in parts of the ditch, and dismantling the palisade of stakes. They weren't destroying their work out of spite. They were denying a potential asset to their foes, ensuring that the landscape offered no advantage to anyone who might be following them. The final stage of the departure was the most dangerous, the actual movement of the army out of the gates and onto the road. This was not a single mass exodus. It was a staggered, strategic maneuver designed to protect the army's most vulnerable element, its long, slow-moving baggage train. The first troops to leave would be the vanguard, typically the cavalry and light infantry. Their job was to secure the route ahead, scouting for ambushes and ensuring the path was clear for the main body. Once the all-clear was given, the main force of the legions would begin their march, filing out of the gates in a predetermined order, century by century. They left behind them an empty, trampled field, the only evidence of their presence being the faint outlines of filled-in ditches and the scars of countless tent pegs in the earth, a ghost of a city that had existed for just one night, already fading back into the landscape. To see these principles applied on a grand, almost unbelievable scale, we must travel to the high plateau of central Gaul in the year 52 BC. Here, the ambitious Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, having united many of the tribes against Rome, made his stand within the fortified oppidum of Alesia. Julius Caesar and his legions arrived, not to launch an immediate assault against the steep cliffs, but to enact a strategy of encirclement that would become a legendary case study in military history. Caesar understood that a direct attack would be suicidal and that a simple blockade would leave his own army vulnerable. His solution was an engineering project of staggering ambition. He would not just besiege Alesia, he would build a cage around it, and then build another, larger cage around himself to defend against the inevitable Gallic relief force. This was the ultimate expression of the Roman marching camp philosophy, expanded to enclose an entire city and the surrounding landscape. The inner ring, aimed at containing Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors, was known as a wall of circumvallation. Imagine the legions not just digging a ditch for a single night, but constructing a continuous fortified line 11 miles long, completely encircling the hilltop fortress. This was not a simple berm, it was a sophisticated defensive system. In front of the main wall, the Romans dug not one, but two massive ditches. The inner one was flooded with water diverted from local rivers, creating a moat that was 20 feet wide. Beyond this, a second dry ditch was excavated, also vast in scale. But the genius was in the passive defenses placed between these ditches. Caesar's engineers planted fields of sharpened stakes, the Sippi, and even more fearsome, the Lilia, those deadly pit traps with sharpened stakes at the bottom, carefully camouflaged with twigs and brush. Any Gallic warrior attempting a sortie would first have to navigate this veritable minefield before even reaching the main Roman wall, all while under fire from the towers above. That main wall was the heart of the system. It stood 12 feet high and was reinforced with a palisade and fortified towers placed at 80-foot intervals. These towers were not simple platforms. They were multi-story structures equipped with artillery, ballistae, and scorpions that could rain down projectiles on any point of the killing zone. And integrated directly into this 11-mile-long fortress were a series of 23 smaller, yet fully equipped Roman forts. These were not just guard posts, they were proper legionary camps, complete with their own ditches, ramparts, and gates, seamlessly woven into the larger defensive line. Each fort housed a garrison, ensuring that every section of the wall was actively manned and could be reinforced quickly from within the system itself. This transformed the circumvallation from a static wall into a dynamic, interconnected defensive network. But Caesar, a commander who always thought several moves ahead, knew his greatest threat was not from within Alesia, but from without. A huge Gallic relief army, reportedly numbering over 250,000 men, was gathering. His response was as audacious as it was logical. He built a second, outer ring of fortifications facing the opposite way. This was the wall of contravallation, an additional 14 miles of ditches, traps, and palisades. This outer wall mirrored the inner one in its deadly complexity, creating a double-walled corridor around Alesia. Caesar's army was now stationed in the no-man's land between these two immense lines. They were simultaneously the besiegers of Alesia and the besieged defenders of their own position, a position that history would call a double circumvallation. The psychological impact on the legions must have been profound. They were building their own potential tomb, trusting entirely in their discipline and their general's genius. The logistical effort behind this endeavor is almost incomprehensible. For weeks, the legions were not fighting men but the landscape itself. They became an army of lumberjacks, miners, and carpenters. Forests were felled to provide the millions of feet of timber needed for the palisades and towers. Quarries were opened to provide stone for the fortifications. The amount of earth moved would have required thousands of tons of soil to be excavated and shaped, all with simple dalabras and wicker baskets. The coordination required to manage these simultaneous, massive construction projects while maintaining a watchful guard against attacks from both sides is a testament to the Roman military machine's peerless organizational structure. Each soldier knew his role, and each centurion his century's task, allowing this city of siege works to rise from the ground with breathtaking speed. The final, brutal test came when the massive Gallic relief army arrived and coordinated its attack with a desperate breakout attempt by Vercingetorix from within Alesia. The ensuing battle was a nightmare scenario for the Romans, who were assaulted from both inside and out simultaneously. Yet, the fortifications proved their worth. The layered defenses, the ditches, the lilies, the Sippi shattered the momentum of the Gallic charges, breaking up their formations and funneling them into killing zones where Roman artillery and javelins could inflict horrific casualties. The integrated forts allowed Caesar to act as the central nervous system of the defense. Stationed on high ground, he could observe the entire battlefield and dispatch reserves from one threatened sector to another along the secure roads within his lines. The legions, fighting from the security of the walls they had built with their own hands, held firm. The relief army was ultimately repulsed in a series of desperate, bloody engagements, and Vercingetorix, seeing his allies defeated, was forced to surrender. The fall of Alesia broke the back of the Gallic rebellion and cemented Roman control over the region. It was a victory won not by a brilliant cavalry charge or a heroic infantry stand, but by the shovel, the dalabra, and the unbreakable discipline of the Roman camp builder. Caesar's masterpiece at Alesia stands as the ultimate proof that in ancient warfare, the most powerful weapon was often not the sword, but the fortification. While the Roman castrum represents a pinnacle of rigid, pre-planned order, this was not the only path to military success in the ancient world. To truly appreciate the diversity of ancient camping, we need to journey beyond the legions and explore how other legendary armies solved the same nightly problem. A fascinating contrast emerges with the forces of Alexander the Great. Alexander's campaign was an epic of constant movement, a relentless drive from Macedonia to the borders of India that covered thousands of miles over a decade. His army was a multinational amalgam, comprising not only Macedonian phalangites and elite companion cavalry, but also Greek allies, and later, vast numbers of incorporated Persian troops. This diverse composition meant there was no single, empire-wide camping manual to follow. Unlike the Romans, Alexander's camps were likely more organic in their layout, shaped by the terrain and the immediate needs of the moment rather than a universal grid. The sheer scale and pace of Alexander's advance forced a different kind of logistical genius. His camps had to be colossal, accommodating a force that could swell to over 100,000 people, including soldiers, support staff, scientists, engineers, and a veritable city of camp followers. Finding a single water source for such a multitude was often impossible, leading to sprawling encampments that might stretch along a riverbank for miles. There was likely a central area for Alexander's own magnificent tent, which served as a mobile court and headquarters, surrounded by the quarters of his generals and the royal hypaspis guards. Beyond this core, the various contingents would have pitched their tents according to their own customs and hierarchies. The Thessalian cavalry camped separately from the Macedonian infantry, and the Persian units would have had their own distinct areas. This created a microcosm of Alexander's empire itself, a diverse, multicultural gathering held together by the sheer force of his leadership and the shared goal of conquest. Where Alexander's camping strategy shows its true brilliance is in its remarkable adaptability. As he moved deeper into the Persian Empire, he didn't just defeat its armies, he absorbed its infrastructure and knowledge. He began to utilize the existing Persian royal road system and its network of supply depots. It is highly probable that his army started to adopt and adapt Persian camping practices, especially for the royal entourage. The Achaemenid Persians were known for their lavish pavilions and their efficient logistical systems for moving the court. Alexander, who increasingly adopted Persian dress and customs to legitimize his rule, would have seen the value in these practices. His camp evolved from a purely Macedonian military base into a hybrid mobile capital, a place where Greek and Persian nobles mingled, reflecting his grand vision of a fused Greco-Persian world. The camp became a tool of policy as much as a military necessity. For a starker contrast in philosophy, we can leap forward more than a millennium to the arid steppes of Central Asia and the armies of the Mongol Empire. If the Roman camp was a temporary fortress and Alexander's a mobile capital, the Mongol camp was something else entirely, an organism built for pure, unadulterated speed. The Mongols achieved the largest contiguous land empire in history, not through heavily armored infantry or complex siege works, but through the breathtaking mobility of their horse archers. Their entire way of war, and thus their way of camp life, was built around this principle. The centerpiece of their camp was the jur, the circular, felt-covered dwelling known in the West as a yurt. This was a masterpiece of portable design. Its wooden lattice frame could be collapsed and folded flat, and its felt covers rolled up tightly. A family or a unit of soldiers could dismantle their entire home and have it loaded onto a cart or a spare horse in under an hour. A Mongol army on the move was a sight to behold. It was less a marching column and more a migrating nation. Thousands of jurs would be transported, and when the order was given to halt, the entire plain would seem to bloom with these white, circular tents, rising from the ground with a speed that would have bewildered a Roman legionary still digging his ditch. There was no standard grid, no permanent streets. The camp layout was often arranged in a great circle, with the tent of the Khan or the commanding general at the center, surrounded by a protective ring of his most trusted warriors. This circular formation was itself a defensive measure, creating a protected enclosure for the herds of horses and livestock that traveled with the army. Defense did not come from static walls, but from the army's incredible strategic mobility and its screen of scouts who could detect threats from dozens of miles away. This comparison between the Roman, Macedonian, and Mongol approaches reveals a fundamental truth of military history. There is no single, best way to set a camp. Instead, each strategy was a perfect reflection of the army's core tactical doctrine and its logistical capabilities. The Romans, who fought as disciplined heavy infantry, needed a secure, predictable base from which they could deploy in orderly lines. Their castrum was the ultimate expression of this infantry-centric worldview. The Mongols, whose power was the swift, devastating cavalry raid, would have viewed the Roman obsession with digging as a fatal liability, anchoring them to one spot and sapping their greatest strength, speed. Alexander's approach fell somewhere in between, blending the need for a command center with the flexibility required for a campaign of unprecedented distance and cultural complexity. The silent, empty fields that hosted these ancient camps thus bear witness to more than just the need for shelter. They are archaeological testaments to the vastly different ways great commanders conceived of war itself, from the methodical fortress building of the legion to the nomadic fluidity of the steppe warrior. But how can we be so certain about the intricate details of these long-vanished temporary cities? After all, leather tents rot, wooden stakes decay, and earthen ramparts eventually erode back into the soil. The answer lies not in dusty scrolls alone, but in the very earth beneath our feet. Archaeology provides the tangible proof, allowing us to walk the ghostly streets of these ancient camps and see the legion's handiwork for ourselves. The most dramatic evidence comes from places where the landscape itself has preserved their outlines with stunning clarity. Take Masada in Israel, for instance. Here, the siege camps built by the Roman 10th Legion around the desert fortress are so impeccably preserved that they look as if the legions only just left. From the top of Masada, you can clearly see the stark, white lines of stone walls that reinforce the ramparts, encircling the entire plateau. The outlines of the camps are perfect rectangles, and within them, you can even distinguish the smaller, orderly lines of the soldiers' barracks areas. This isn't a theoretical reconstruction. It's a fossilized moment in time, a direct view into the relentless efficiency of the Roman war machine. In other parts of the world, the evidence is more subtle but no less compelling. Across the windswept hills and moors of northern Britain, in Scotland and Northumberland, the ghosts of Roman marching camps are etched into the turf. From ground level, these sites might just look like a series of faint, grassy bumps and depressions. But from the air, especially under the low, raking light of sunrise or sunset, the full picture emerges. Aerial photography reveals the unmistakable shapes of these temporary fortresses as dark crop marks or shadows in the grass. The outlines of the defensive ditches, long since filled in, affect the growth of the vegetation above, tracing the precise rectangular or playing card shape of the camp for modern observers to discover. These phantom forts, sometimes several from different campaigns overlapping on the same hilltop, provide a map of the Roman army's advance, a permanent record of their nightly ritual of security carved directly into the British landscape. When visible surface traces are absent, archaeologists turn to sophisticated technology to see what lies beneath. Techniques like ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have revolutionized our understanding. These geophysical surveys act like X-rays for the soil, allowing researchers to map buried features without ever putting a shovel in the ground. A magnetometer can detect the slight magnetic disturbances caused by ancient human activity. A filled-in ditch, packed with different soil and organic material, will have a different magnetic signature than the undisturbed ground around it. Even more remarkably, these tools can pinpoint the locations of individual post holes, the dark, soil-filled voids left where the sharpened stakes of the palisade were driven into the ground. By mapping these patterns, archaeologists can recreate the entire layout of the camp with astonishing accuracy. They can trace the routes of the main streets, the Via Praetoria and Via Principales, and even identify the small, rectangular clusters of post holes that mark the spots where each 8-man tent was pitched. This technology transforms an empty field into a detailed blueprint, confirming the ancient descriptions of a perfectly ordered grid. But the story doesn't end with just identifying the camps. The debris left behind by the soldiers tells its own rich story about daily life. Excavations of more permanent bases, or sites where an army stayed for an extended siege, yield a treasure trove of everyday objects. Archaeologists unearth the hobnails from legionary sandals, which scatter like tiny black seeds across a site, revealing the paths the soldiers walked. They find fragments of the distinctive segmented plate armor, called lorica segmentata, and the heavy iron points of pilum javelins. Perhaps most evocative are the small, personal items lost or discarded: a worn-out dice made of bone, a bronze stylus for writing on wax tablets, a broken piece of a delicate glass perfume bottle that might have held a luxury item from home. Each of these artifacts is a direct connection to an individual soldier, a silent witness to the reality of life within those temporary walls. This physical evidence does more than just confirm the historical texts. It adds color, depth, and humanity to our understanding, turning the legendary discipline of the ancient armies from an abstract concept into a tangible, documented fact of history. The incredible system of the marching camp, the castra aestiva, was the ultimate tool of conquest, allowing Rome's legions to project power deep into hostile territory. But as the empire expanded, its strategic needs shifted from relentless advance to enduring control. The camp, that masterpiece of temporary engineering, had to evolve. It transformed from a single night's shelter into a semi-permanent home, and finally, into a formidable stone fortress that stood for centuries. This evolution of the camp is a direct reflection of the evolution of the Roman Empire itself, from a dynamic republic on the march to a sprawling imperial power focused on defending its vast frontiers. The first step in this transformation was the shift from the overnight marching camp to the castra stativa, or semi-permanent campaign base. Imagine a legion that is pushed into a new, unconquered region. The campaign is not a swift summer affair but a multi-year effort to subdue a stubborn enemy. As autumn gives way to winter, the weather makes further campaigning impossible. The army cannot simply return to a distant province. It must hunker down where it is. This is when the castra aestiva is reinvented for a long-term stay. The ditch is dug deeper, the rampart is built higher and wider, and the simple palisade of sharpened stakes is replaced by a proper timber revetment, a solid wooden wall with a walkway and a parapet. The tents, which offered little protection against months of rain and snow, are gradually replaced by more substantial structures. The soldiers, using their engineering skills, erect long, low barracks built from local timber, with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. These buildings offered genuine shelter from the elements, with each contubernium getting its own small room and a shared hearth for warmth. A proper headquarters building, a hospital, and storage warehouses would also be constructed from wood. The castra stativa was a winter city, a testament to the legion's ability to not just pass through a landscape, but to dominate it through the harshest seasons, emerging ready to fight again in the spring. This concept reached its zenith during prolonged sieges, like the one we explored at Alesia. There, the castra stativa became an entire fortified landscape, a clear statement that the Romans were not leaving until the job was done. But the most significant evolution occurred along the stable frontiers of the empire, such as the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe or Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Here, Rome's expansionist phase was largely over. The new mission was not conquest, but border control Pax Romana, the Roman peace. To enforce this peace, the legions needed permanent homes. Thus was born the Castra Legionis, the permanent legionary fortress. These were not just enlarged versions of marching camps. They were fundamentally different in both materials and purpose. Built to last for generations, they were constructed from stone and brick, their foundations sunk deep into the earth as a symbol of Roman permanence. The layout, however, remained hauntingly familiar. The ghost of the original marching camp grid lived on in the stone streets of the permanent fortress. You could still walk the Via Praetoria and the Via Principales, but now they were paved roads, flanked by stone gutters. The headquarters building, the Principia, was no longer a large tent but a massive stone complex at the center of the fortress, complete with a vaulted strong room for the legion's pay and a grand hall for assemblies. The soldiers' barracks transformed from timber huts into long, sturdy stone buildings, each housing a sentry, with smaller rooms for the men and a more comfortable suite for the centurion. The fortress contained everything a community of 5,000 soldiers needed for a lifetime of service: elaborate bath houses for hygiene, a hospital for healthcare, workshops for craftsmen, and even amphitheaters for entertainment. These fortresses became powerful economic and cultural hubs, with sprawling civilian settlements, or canabi, growing up outside their walls, filled with traders, families, and veterans. The legionary fortress was the ultimate expression of the Roman camp, a permanent piece of Rome implanted in a foreign land, ensuring that the empire's borders were not just lines on a map, but heavily garrisoned bastions of civilization and power. Yet beyond the formidable ditches and the sharpened palisade, the Roman camp possessed a weapon far more potent than any sword or spear: the power of psychological dominance. Imagine you are a warrior from a local tribe, perhaps a Gaul or a Briton, cautiously watching from a distant forest ridge as the Roman column arrives in your homeland. You see this vast, seemingly disorganized mass of men and animals trudging along the river valley. They look tired, vulnerable. Your chieftain might be tempted to plan a dawn raid, to catch them unprepared. But then you witness the impossible. Over the next few hours, as the sun arcs toward the horizon, that empty field undergoes a metamorphosis. A deep ditch is carved from the earth, a rampart rises as if summoned from the soil, and a bristling wall of wood takes shape. Straight streets materialize, and a miniature, orderly city emerges with a speed that defies belief. The message this spectacle sent was not just one of engineering skill, it was a declaration of Roman invincibility. For any observer, the chilling realization would set in: this was not a band of raiders. This was a force of nature, an entity so disciplined, so relentlessly organized, that it could not be surprised, flustered, or worn down. The sheer predictability of the camp's layout, the unbreakable routine, was in itself a form of intimidation. It demonstrated a cold, mechanical efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the more fluid, often chaotic, war bands of tribal societies. The camp was a performance, a carefully staged demonstration of power designed to win battles by convincing potential enemies that resistance was futile before a single javelin was ever thrown. This psychological fortress was just as crucial for the men inside the walls. After a grueling day's march through potentially hostile territory, weighed down by armor and the constant threat of ambush, the act of building the camp was a powerful ritual that restored a sense of control. The physical labor of digging the ditch and raising the rampart was more than just work. It was a therapeutic process. With every shovelful of earth, the soldiers were literally building their own safety, transforming their environment from a place of danger into a place of refuge. The rigid, predictable layout of the castrum provided a profound psychological comfort. In a world of uncertainty, where the next day could bring a bloody battle or a treacherous mountain pass, the camp was an island of absolute order. A legionary, no matter how far from home, could walk the Via Principalis and find his century's tent in the exact same relative position as it had been in Britannia, or Africa, or Syria. This unwavering routine created a crucial sense of normalcy, a mental anchor in the chaotic sea of campaign life. It reinforced the soldier's identity, reminding him that he was not just a man alone in the wilderness, but a vital cog in the greatest military machine the world had ever known. The camp also functioned as a powerful tool for building and sustaining morale through communal living. The structure of the contubernium, the 8-man tent group, fostered an environment of intense camaraderie. These men were more than fellow soldiers, they were a military family. They marched together, fought together, and at the end of the day they cooked, ate, and slept side by side. The shared experience of hardship, from the back-breaking grind of grinding grain for their evening meal to the quiet conversations inside their leather tent, forged bonds of loyalty that were as strong as steel. A soldier did not fight for an abstract idea of an emperor in far-off Rome. He fought for the 7 men who shared his bread and whose lives depended on his vigilance. This micro-level solidarity, replicated across hundreds of tents, created an army that was incredibly resilient. Fear and doubt, the great underminers of morale, were harder to foster in an environment where every man was surrounded by his closest companions. The camp, with its grid of tiny, self-sufficient households, was the crucible where this essential esprit de corps was forged and strengthened every single night. Furthermore, the presence of the camp's amenities, the marketplace, the hospital, The bathhouse and more permanent installations served as a constant reminder of the civilization they represented and the logistical might that supported them. The ability to buy a better meal from a merchant, to have a wound properly treated by a medic, or to simply bathe in a purpose-built facility, set the Roman soldier apart. It told him that his well-being was valued, that he was part of a system that could provide comforts even at the edge of the known world. This stood in stark contrast to many of their adversaries, for whom campaign life was often a story of hunger, exposure, and untreated injuries. The Roman camp, therefore, was not just a defensive structure, it was a state of mind. It cultivated a professional pride and a sense of superiority that made the legionary believe in his own invincibility. He slept securely, not only because of the walls he had built, but because of the unshakable confidence those walls represented. This intangible strength, this belief in their own system, often proved to be the decisive factor, allowing a tired, outnumbered legion to stand firm where a less disciplined force would have shattered and fled. So, the next time your mind's eye conjures an ancient army, push past the familiar spectacle of clashing shields and roaring charges. Look instead to the quiet, empty field at the end of a long day's march. See the incredible, mobile city that rose from that emptiness before darkness fell, a feat of logistics, engineering, and sheer, back-breaking labor that was arguably more vital to victory than any sword or spear. The humble army camp was the unsung hero of military history, the silent foundation upon which empires were truly won. It was the ultimate expression of discipline, a physical manifestation of order imposed upon chaos. From the Roman legionary who knew his tent's exact location by heart to the Mongol horsemen who could erect a home in an hour, this daily ritual was a testament to human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure. It reminds us that history's greatest conquests were not just about moments of berserk courage on the battlefield, but about the quiet, relentless, and brilliantly organized effort that made those moments possible. It's a powerful lesson in how ordinary people, through systems and shared purpose, can achieve the extraordinary. If you found this journey into the hidden world of ancient logistics fascinating, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of the past, and let us know in the comments below. If you could step back in time, which ancient army would you have wanted to march with? Would it be the relentless legions of Rome, the swift conquerors of Alexander, or the nomadic warriors of the steppes? We love hearing from you,